what drives a good man to the edge of desperation. For Jebediah Cain, it was the silence of a wife's grave, the silence of an empty sky that refused to rain, and the silence of a future slowly turning to dust. He was a man with nothing left to lose, until one night a sound from his barn changed everything. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a thief. It was a secret wrapped in silk and smelling of fear that would force him to make a choice before the sun came up, a choice that could save him or hang him. This is the story of a vow made in darkness and the staggering price of the light that followed. The dust of the Arizona Territory had a taste. Jebediah Cain knew it better than any man. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated his tongue, settled in the lines around his eyes, and whispered of failure with every gust of wind that rattled the loose panes of his cabin. It was the taste of his life for the past year, ever since he'd buried Martha. His homestead, nestled in the formidable shadow of the Chiricahua Mountains, was dying. The creek bed was a cracked, stony scar. His small herd of cattle were walking skeletons, their ribs a grim washboard beneath dusty hides. The only thing that grew with any vigor was the small wooden cross on the hill, marking the place where all the color had bled from his world. He was a good man, or at least he had been. Now he was just a tired one. A widower at 32, with a daughter 6-year-old Lily, whose eyes were becoming as old and weary as his own. She was quiet, a little ghost, in their silent cabin, clutching the corn-husk doll Martha had made for her. Jebediah knew he was failing her. A child needed a mother's touch, a woman's presence to soften the harsh edges of this land and this life. The thought had festered in his mind for months, a desperate, shameful idea. A mail-order bride. He'd even written the letter, his calloused fingers clumsy with the pencil, and sent it off with a traveling merchant weeks ago. He'd scraped together the last of his savings for the agency fee and the woman's ticket. He hadn't told a soul. It felt like a betrayal of Martha, a cold, practical transaction to replace the irreplaceable. But Lily's gaunt face in the lantern light was a more potent guilt. He was a father first. The reply had come tucked into the saddlebag of a post rider. A woman named Annalise Schmidt from Boston would be arriving in the town of Wilcox on the 20th of May. That was 2 days ago. Jebediah had ridden into Wilcox, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He'd waited at the station, holding a wilted bunch of desert wildflowers, feeling like the world's biggest fool. The train had come and gone. Every passenger disembarked, but no one looked for him. No woman matching the agency's prim description appeared. He'd asked the station master, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar. "Saw a fancy one, yeah?" The man had grunted, not looking up from his ledger. Met by Silas Croft. They rode off in his buggy hours ago. The name hit Jebediah like a physical blow. Silas Croft. The man who owned the bank, the saloon, and half the territory, it seemed. The man who held the note on Jebediah's land, the due date looming like a hangman's noose. Croft was a viper in a tailored suit, known for his predatory loans and his even more predatory appetites. The idea of this refined Boston woman falling into his hands made Jebediah's stomach clench. He'd assumed Croft had simply outbid him, stolen his last hope with the casual cruelty of the rich. Defeated, he had ridden the long miles home. The silence of the prairie screaming his failure. Now 2 nights later, the moon was a merciless silver eye in the sky, illuminating his withered corn stalks. He'd just gotten Lily to sleep her breath a soft whisper in the oppressive quiet. He sat on his porch, a Winchester rifle across his lap, not for any particular threat, but because its cold, hard weight was a comfort. That's when he heard it. A soft rustle from the barn. Not the scuttling of a rat or the sigh of a cow. It was a measured sound, a shifting, a sigh that sounded almost human. His heart hammered against his ribs. A squatter, a thief after his last few tools. He rose silently, the Winchester now feeling less like a comfort and more like a necessity. The dust didn't even stir under his worn boots as he crossed the yard. The barn door was ajar, a dark, gaping mouth. He slipped inside his eyes, adjusting to the gloom, the familiar scent of hay dust and animal sweat filling his lungs. Moonlight slanted through the cracks in the walls, striping the interior with silver. He saw the source of the sound. In the far stall, burrowed into a pile of clean hay, he'd been saving for his ailing horse, was a figure, a person. As he crept closer, his breath hitched. It was a woman. She was asleep, her body curled in on itself like a child's. One arm was tucked beneath her head, and moonlight caught the pale, oval shape of her face. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a mess of loose strands and bits of straw. She wore a dress that might have once been elegant, a deep blue traveling suit, but was now smudged with dirt and hopelessly rumpled. Her face, even in sleep, was etched with exhaustion and fear. At her side, clutched in her other hand, was a small, ornate silver locket. Jebediah stood frozen, a dozen questions warring in his mind. Who was she? How did she get here? His barn was a good 5 miles from the nearest road. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to test if she were real. As his shadow fell over her, her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of green, and for a moment they were wide with disorientation. Then they found him, a tall, rough-looking man, looming over her with a rifle, and they filled with pure, undiluted terror. She scrambled backward, kicking up hay, a small gasp escaping her lips. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and raw. "Please don't hurt me." Her accent was refined out of place, the sound of city cobblestones, not dusty plains. Jebediah immediately lowered the rifle, holding his hands up to show they were empty. "I ain't gonna hurt you, Mom," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is my barn. I need to ask what you're doing here." Tears welled in her eyes, carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "He left me." She choked out the words, tumbling over each other in a rush of shame and panic. "The man, Mr. Croft, he met me at the station. He said I wasn't what he'd pictured. He said my picture must have been a lie. He laughed and drove me out into the middle of nowhere and just left me on the side of the road." Jebediah's blood ran cold. It was her, Annalise Schmidt, his bride. Croft hadn't stolen her. He'd rejected her and discarded her like trash. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. "You've been walking?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded miserably. "For days, I think. I saw the light from your cabin. I didn't want to disturb anyone. The barn was open. I just wanted to rest for a moment." He saw it all then. The desperation that had driven her across the country, the humiliation of her rejection, the terror of being abandoned in an unforgiving wilderness. And he saw his own reflection in her plight. 2 people brought to the very end of their respective ropes by circumstance and the cruelty of others. An idea wild and dangerous sparked in the tinder of his desperation. It was insane. It was unthinkable. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only path. "Mr. Croft, he's a powerful man," Jebediah said, thinking aloud. "If he finds out you're here on my land unmarried, he could use that. He could ruin you, accuse you of anything." He looked at her, at the rips in her fine dress, the straw in her hair. No one would believe her word against Silas Croft's. "And he holds the note on this farm," he added the confession, tasting like ash. "He wants this land. He'd use you to get it." Annalise's face went paler, if that was even possible. "What am I to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere to go. No money. Nothing." Jebediah took a deep breath, the scent of hay filling his lungs. The wild idea had taken root. "There's one thing we could do," he said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was racing. "One way to protect you, to protect this farm, to protect my daughter." She looked at him, her green eyes searching his face in the moonlight, trying to gauge if he was a savior or a different kind of predator. "What? We get married," he said. The words hung in the air, stark and unbelievable. "Right now, before dawn, before anyone knows you're here, before Croft can make a move. We tell everyone you arrived as planned and we married immediately. It would be our word against his. A wife has a right to be in her husband's barn." Annalise stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "Marry you? A complete stranger?" "We're both strangers here, ma'am," he replied, a grim truth in his tone. "You a stranger to this land. Me a stranger to the man I used to be. I'm not a man who would normally suggest such a thing. I loved my wife, but she's gone, and my little girl needs a mother, and I need help. And you, ma'am, you need protection. You need a home. It wouldn't be a marriage of affection. It would be a partnership, a fortress, an alliance against a common enemy." He could see the war in her eyes, the instinct to run, to scream, to reject this madness. But he could also see the cold, hard calculation. Where would she run? Back into the desert. To a town where her reputation was already mud before she even arrived. She had seen the cruelty of this new world firsthand. His offer, as insane as it was a shield. She looked around the dusty barn, then back at his face. He wasn't handsome in the way of city men. His face was weathered by sun and worry, his hands calloused and scarred. But his eyes, she noted, were direct, and held no trace of the leering contempt she'd seen in Silas Croft's. They held a desperate sort of honor. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "And your daughter?" "Lily," he supplied. "She's asleep in the house. She misses her mother. Something fierce. It won't be easy." "Nothing has been," Annalise whispered. "Then we're agreed." Jebediah pressed the urgency of the rising sun pushing at him. Another nod, this one more certain. There was no preacher for 100 miles. There was no church, no flowers, no witnesses, save for a sleeping horse and the judgmental moon. Jebediah took her hand. It was soft and small in his rough grasp. "There's no one but God to hear us," he said, "but that's enough out here." He cleared his throat, his voice feeling too loud in the sacred quiet. "I, Jebediah Kane, take you, Annalise Schmidt, to be my wedded wife, to have and to all to hold, to protect, and to provide for. Before God and whatever spirits watch over this forsaken land, I pledge you my name and my home." He looked at her expectantly. Her lips parted, and her voice, though barely a whisper, was clear. "I, Anneliese Schmidt, take you, Jebediah Kane, to be my wedded husband." She took a shaky breath. To honor and to aid. I accept your protection and your name." It was done, a pact made in shadow and desperation. As the first hint of grey light began to silhouette the distant Chiricahua, Jebediah Kane, the struggling widower, led his abandoned, exhausted, and now legally wedded wife out of the barn and toward the dim light of the cabin where his sleeping daughter lay, completely unaware that her entire world had just changed forever. The silence of the homestead had been broken, replaced by the deafening thunder of an impossible vow. The sun rose with the indifferent brilliance it always did, casting long, stark shadows across the yard. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Anneliese sat at the small, rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee that was bitter and strong enough to strip paint. She had washed her face in a basin of cold water, the shock of it a small, sharp anchor in the sea of unreality she found herself in. Jebediah. Her husband moved about the small space with a practiced, heavy sort of grace. He stoked the fire in the cast-iron stove, his movements economical and silent. He hadn't said more than 10 words since they'd entered the cabin. The vow made in the barn felt like a dream, but the solid, unfamiliar weight of this man's presence was undeniably real. The cabin was one room meticulously clean, but heartbreakingly bare. A large bed, his bed stood in one corner. A smaller cot where a little girl lay sleeping was in another. A few shelves held tin plates and a handful of books. A woman's touch was evident in the faded, patched quilt on the bed, and the carefully sewn curtains on the single window, but it was the touch of a ghost. Anneliese felt like an intruder, a usurper. The sound of movement came from the cot. Lily sat up, rubbing her eyes. She was a miniature version of Jebediah, with the same serious set to her mouth, but her eyes, a deep, sorrowful brown, must have been her mother's. She looked at her father, then her gaze fell on Anneliese. The child's eyes widened first with confusion, then with a deep, primal suspicion. She clutched her corn-husk doll tighter. Jebediah knelt by her cot. "Lilybug," he said, his voice softer than Anneliese had yet heard it. "Morning." "Pa," Lily whispered, her eyes never leaving Anneliese. "Who is that?" Jebediah's shoulders seemed to slump with the weight of the moment. He had fought off starvation, drought and grief, but this was a different kind of battle. "Lily, this is Anneliese. She's going to be staying with us. She's my wife now." The words spoken in the clear light of day sounded even more absurd. Lily's face crumpled. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was a quiet, devastating collapse. Her lower lip trembled, and she shook her head, burying her face in the thin blanket. "No," came the muffled cry. "You can't. Mama." "Shh, now," Jebediah soothed, stroking her hair. "Your mama will always be your mama. No one can ever change that. But we need help, Bug. I need help. And Anneliese needed a home." Anneliese felt a hot flush of shame. She was an inconvenience, a necessity, a stray dog taken in for practical reasons. She wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort to the weeping child. But what could she say? "Hello. I'm the woman your father married in a barn to spite a villain." She remained silent, her hands trembling around her mug. This was her new life. A grieving husband, a hostile child, and a cabin that felt more like a kiu than a sanctuary. The days that followed were a torturous dance of avoidance and awkward proximity. Annalise tried to make herself useful. She had been raised in a wealthy Boston home with servants to handle every domestic task. But she was not stupid, and she was not lazy. She was, however, completely inept. Her first attempt at biscuits were charred, inedible rocks. She tried to milk their one remaining cow, Bessie, and ended up with a kicked pail and a shin full of bruises. She tried to mend one of Jebediah's shirts and pricked her finger so many times it looked like she'd been in a brawl with a cactus. Jebediah was maddeningly patient. He never criticized, never raised his voice. He would simply watch her struggle for a moment, then quietly take the task from her and complete it himself. His silence was worse than any rebuke. It was a constant, unspoken commentary on her uselessness. Lily was her own silent storm. The child would not speak to her. She would not even look at her. If Annalise entered the cabin, Lily would retreat to her cot, turning her back. If Annalise offered her a piece of bread, Lily would stare at it as if it were poison, until Jebediah gave it to her instead. Annalise was a phantom in their home, her presence tolerated but never acknowledged. The only solace Annalise found was in a small, locked metal box she had managed to keep with her through the ordeal. It contained her few possessions, a change of clothes, a brush, and a handful of books. One evening, desperate for an escape, she unlocked it and pulled out a worn copy of Jane Eyre. She sat at the table, the lantern light pooling around her, and lost herself in the words. Jebediah, patching a piece of leather harness, watched her from the corner of his eye. He hadn't seen a woman read with such focus since the town schoolmarm. A few nights later, Annalise noticed Lily watching her. The child was on her cot, pretending to be asleep, but one eye was cracked open, tracking Annalise as she turned a page. A fragile, tentative idea formed in Annalise's mind. The next evening, she didn't open the book immediately. She looked over at the cot where Lily was lying back turned. "When I was a little girl," Annalise said softly, speaking to the child's back. "My father used to read to me every night. He had a great booming voice. He would read stories of knights and dragons, of clever foxes and lost princesses." There was no response. The small back remained rigid. "My favorite," Annalise continued, her voice gaining a little strength, "was about a girl who had to live with a great grumpy beast. Everyone was afraid of him. But the girl wasn't. She knew that underneath all the growling and the fur, he was just lonely." She waited. The silence stretched. Just as she was about to give up to retreat back into her own world of words, a tiny voice piped up from the cot. "Did the beast have a little girl?" Annalise's heart leaped. She kept her voice even calm. "No. He was all alone in his big castle. That's why he was so grumpy." Lily turned over slowly, her brown eyes fixed on Annalise. "Why was he lonely?" "Because he had closed his heart off." Annalise said the words, feeling strangely personal. He was afraid to let anyone in. Lily considered this with the profound seriousness of a 6-year-old. "Pa's not a beast," she stated, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "No." Annalise agreed immediately. "Your pa is a good man, the best of men." She saw Jebediah pause in his work. His head bowed, but she knew he was listening. That night marked a tiny, almost imperceptible thaw. The next day, Lily didn't turn her back. The day after, she watched Annalise attempt to knead bread, a silent, curious observer. The real breakthrough came a week after the wedding in the barn. Annalise was trying to sweep the perpetual dust from the cabin floor. She was clumsy with the rough broom, her movements jerky. Lily sat on the edge of her cot, watching. "You're doing it wrong," Lily said, her first direct words to Annalise that weren't a question. Annalise stopped looking at the child. "Oh, can you show me?" Lily slid off the cot. She took the broom, which was almost as tall as she was, and began to sweep with short, efficient strokes, just as she had seen her mother do 1,000 times. "You have to push the dirt all to one spot," she instructed, her small voice full of authority. "Then you scoop it. You're just chasing it around." Annalise watched a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time since she'd arrived. "You're a very good teacher, Lily." A faint blush touched the child's cheeks. From his chair, Jebediah watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable. But when he caught Annalise's eye, he gave a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of approval, of thanks, that felt more intimate than any touch. That afternoon, Jebediah announced he was riding into Wilcox for supplies. It was a trip he had to make, but a dangerous one. It would be their story's first test. "You need to stay inside, both of you," he said, his hand on the cabin door. He looked at Annalise. "If anyone comes asking, you're my wife. You arrived on the 20th, we married the next day. The station master was busy. He must have been mistaken." It was a flimsy story, but it was all they had. He hesitated, then turned back to her. "Annalise," he said, using her name with a discomfort that was almost painful. "Thank you. For the sweeping." And then he was gone, a lonely figure on his gaunt horse, disappearing into the vast, shimmering heat. Annalise stood at the window watching him go, the weight of the name she now carried, Cain, settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just Annalise Schmidt, the abandoned bride. She was the wife of a struggling farmer, a stand-in mother to a grieving child, and a co-conspirator in a desperate lie. And their greatest enemy was about to find out she hadn't vanished into the desert after all. Wilcox was a town built on dust and desperation. It clung to the railroad tracks like a burr to a blanket, a necessary evil for the ranchers and homesteaders scattered across the territory. As Jebediah rode down the main street, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his gut. Every pair of eyes felt like an accusation. He tied his horse in front of the general store, the place he dreaded most. The store was run by a balding, perpetually worried man named Henderson, but its true owner, like everything else in town, was Silas Croft. Jebediah pushed through the doors, the bell above announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that grated on his nerves. Silas Croft was there. He was leaning against the counter, impeccably dressed in a dark waistcoat and tailored trousers, a stark contrast to the dusty, weary men around him. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and a predatory smile played on his lips as he saw Jebediah enter. "Well, well, Cain," Croft said, his voice smooth and laced with condescension. "Come to beg for an the calendar pages turn, you know, even out here in God's forgotten pantry." Jebediah ignored him, walking to the counter. "Henderson, need flour, salt, and coffee." Henderson wrung his hands, glancing nervously at Croft. "Right away, Jebediah." Croft pushed himself off the counter and walked a slow circle around Jebediah like a wolf inspecting a lame deer. "I heard you were at the station the other day. Waiting for someone, were we?" "A little package from the east." He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Terrible shame. These agencies, you can't trust them. They send out damaged goods. Had to refuse the delivery myself. Sent it packing." Jebediah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the eyes of the other men in the store on them. This was a performance for Croft, a display of his power. "My business is my own, Croft," Jebediah said, his voice dangerously low. "Is it?" Croft purred, stepping closer. "I hold the paper on your scrap of land. That makes your business my business. Everything from the number of head you have left to the quality of the dirt you're buried in. And speaking of business, I've been hearing a rumor, a most amusing rumor." Jebediah's heart began to pound. "I don't listen to rumors. You should listen to this one," Croft said, his eyes gleaming. "The story goes that the damaged goods I sent packing wasn't so damaged after all. That she, by some miracle, found her way to a certain failing homestead, and that the lonely widower who lives there took her in." He leaned in his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, Kane, is your barn cozier than it used to be?" The air crackled with tension. Jebediah turned slowly to face him, his eyes like chips of flint. He knew this was the moment. The lie had to be sold, and it had to be sold with absolute conviction. "You heard wrong," Jebediah said, his voice clear and steady. "My wife arrived on the 20th, just as planned. We were married by the time the sun came up the next morning. Your station master must be going blind in his old age." A flicker of surprise, then rage, crossed Croft's face. He hadn't expected a direct counter. He had expected shame denial, a stammering confession. "Your wife." Croft repeated the word, tasting like poison in his mouth. "Annalise Kane," Jebediah said, letting the name hang in the air. "She's at the homestead now, looking after my daughter. Something you wouldn't understand, Croft. A home, a family." Croft's face darkened, the mask of civility, slipping to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had deemed unworthy and left for dead, had not only survived, but had aligned herself with his debtor. It was an affront to his pride, an unexpected move on the chessboard he controlled. "We'll see how long that home lasts," Croft hissed. "Your note is due at the end of the month. I will have my money or I will have my land, and everything on it." His eyes held a possessive, dangerous light, and Jebediah knew with sickening certainty that Croft's threat now included Annalise. Jebediah grabbed his supplies, threw the coins on the counter, and walked out without another word, Croft's venomous gaze burning into his back. The ride home was a blur of fear and fury. The lie had been told, the gauntlet thrown down. But it had also confirmed Croft's interest. He wouldn't let this go. He arrived back at the cabin as twilight bled across the sky. The warm glow of the lantern in the window was a beacon in the growing darkness. When he opened the door, a scene he never could have imagined greeted him. The table was set for 3. In the center, on a tin plate, sat a lopsided, slightly pale, but definitely recognizable loaf of bread. Annalise was standing by the stove, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her expression a mixture of anxiety and pride. Lily was at the table, carefully arranging 3 forks. She looked up and gave him a small, shy smile. "Annalise made bread, Pa," Lily announced. "It's not like Mama's. It's Boston bread." Annalise flushed. "I'm sorry it didn't rise quite right." Jebediah put his supplies down his heart, aching with a complicated mix of emotions. He picked up a piece of the bread. It was dense and chewy, nothing like Martha's light, airy loaves. But it was bread, made in his home, by her hands. "It's good," he said, and the relief that washed over Annalise's face was so profound, it nearly broke his heart. It's real good." Later that night, after Lily was asleep, a new quiet settled between them. It wasn't the hostile silence of the first week, but something different, a shared tension. "I saw Croft in town," Jebediah said, his voice low. Annalise, who had been mending one of Lily's dresses, her stitches still clumsy but now more determined, looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "What did he say?" "He knows you're here, or he suspected. I told him we were married." "Did he believe you?" she whispered. "I think so. But he's angry. Angrier than I've ever seen him. He made a threat. The note on the farm is due soon, Annalise. I don't have the money. I was hoping for a good season. But the drought..." He trailed off, the failure raw in his voice. "When he takes the farm, he thinks he'll be taking you too." Annalise put down her sewing, her face pale in the lamplight. The brief domestic peace of the evening evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. She had escaped the wilderness, only to find herself trapped in a different way, a pawn in a feud between two men. "He cannot do that," she said, a strange firmness in her voice. "I am your wife." The law out here is what a man like Croft says it is," Jebediah countered bitterly. "He has the sheriff in his pocket. He has the money. We have nothing." Annalise stood up and walked to the small metal box that held her few belongings. She unlocked it with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck. Jebediah watched, confused, as she bypassed the books and clothes and felt for a false bottom. With a click, a hidden compartment opened. From it, she withdrew a sheaf of folded papers tied with a ribbon. They were not books or letters. They looked like legal documents covered in fine, dense script. "We may not have money, Jebediah," she said, turning to face him, the papers in her hand. "But we might not have nothing." He stared at her, then at the documents. "What are those?" "My father was not just a wealthy man," Annalise explained, her voice gaining a confidence he had never heard before. "He was a cunning one, a railroad investor and a financier. He despised men like Croft bullies who use debt as a weapon. He taught me to read contracts, to understand loopholes, to see the traps hidden in the fine print." She untied the ribbon. "And this," she said, holding up a specific document, "is not from my father. This is something I acquired. It's a copy of a loan agreement from a Boston bank. A loan made out to a Mr. Silas Croft for a failed mining venture. A loan he defaulted on before he fled west and reinvented himself." She looked at Jebediah, her green eyes shining with a fierce intelligence. "He built his empire here on a foundation of lies and stolen money. And I think," she said, tapping another document, "that the language in his Boston default contract is remarkably similar to the standard land deeds he uses here in Arizona." Jebediah was speechless. This woman, this fragile city bird he had rescued from his barn, was not what she seemed at all. He had offered her his protection, but it was suddenly shockingly possible that the key to his own salvation was lying in her hands. The abandoned bride was about to become a warrior. Jebediah stared at the sheaf of papers Annalise spread across the rough-hewn table. The lamplight made the ink gleam as if alive. "I don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "What's a defaulted loan from back east got to do with us?" Annalise's initial timidity had vanished, replaced by a focused intensity that was mesmerizing. "Everything," she said, her voice firm. "Men like Silas Croft are creatures of habit and arrogance. They find a trick that works and use it until they are caught. He didn't just leave his debts in Boston. He brought his methods with him." She slid Jebediah's own loan agreement into the center of the light. He was so enamored with the predatory power of his old contracts that he copied the language word for word. He thinks this clause gives him the right to seize your land and everything on it. She then tapped the Boston document. But he made a fatal mistake. That language creates a loophole. Jebediah listened, his mind struggling to keep pace. Because he built his entire enterprise here using capital from that defaulted loan. Annalise explained, her voice cutting through the complex legality. One can argue that the Boston bank he fled has a senior claim on all his assets, a claim that predates and supersedes his claim on your farm. She looked at him, her green eyes sharp and clear. In the simplest terms, Jebediah Mr. Croft does not have the legal authority to foreclose on you. His original creditors do, and they would be very interested to learn where their fugitive debtor has been hiding his wealth. Before he could fully absorb the shock, she produced another set of papers from her hidden compartment, a sealed envelope and a letter of introduction. My family had dealings with that bank. I know the vice president, a Mr. Abernathy who despises Croft for the fraud he committed. This, she said, holding up the sealed envelope, is a letter I have prepared to be sent with the next post rider. It details Croft's operations in Wilcox and provides his exact location. All it needs is a witness signature from a local authority to be considered official. Once Mr. Abernathy receives it, he will send federal marshals, not some timid sheriff Croft has in his pocket. Jebediah was speechless, staring at the woman before him. He had married a stranger to protect her, seeing her as a delicate city creature who needed his strength. He had been profoundly wrong. He had a Winchester rifle. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and a pen that was far more lethal. A new kind of awe replaced his desperation. Annalise. He finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. Why, you could have used this to buy your passage back east. Why do all this for me? Her gaze softened, the fierce strategist receding to reveal the vulnerable woman beneath. And go back to what? She asked quietly. To a gilded cage, an arranged marriage to a man I despise. I chose the unknown over the unbearable, Jebediah. She looked around the simple cabin, her eyes resting on the cot where Lily slept. The first days here were the hardest of my life. I felt useless, terrified. But you treated me with a gentle respect I have never known. You didn't mock me when I burned the biscuits. You gave me your name when you had every reason to turn me away. A small, watery laugh escaped her. You think this is your fight, but it became my fight the moment Silas Croft left me on that road. He tried to erase me. I will not be erased. You gave me a home and a family worth fighting for. In that moment, the entire foundation of their arrangement shifted. The marriage of convenience, the pact of desperation was reforged by the fire of shared purpose into something true. It was no longer his fight. It was theirs. Jebediah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit expanse of his dying farm. For the first time in a year, a flicker of genuine hope broke through the despair. The suffocating weight of inevitable defeat had lifted. He turned back to Annalise, who was carefully gathering the precious documents. He'll come here, Jebediah said, his voice now laced with certainty. When the end of the month comes, he won't send the sheriff. He'll come himself. He'll want to watch my face when he takes it all. It's his nature. Annalise met his gaze, her own eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering intelligence. Then we will be ready for him. The viper was coming, but the homestead was no longer a victim's pen. It was a trap. The last days of the month passed with the slow, agonizing tension of a drawn bowstring. A brittle heat baked the land, but inside the cabin, The looming threat had forged the three of them into a single determined unit. Annalise had taught Lily her letters. Lily had shown Annalise which wild herbs were safe. Jebediah watched them, a strange mix of hope and fear warring in his chest. Their plan resting on a sheaf of papers, and Annalise's courage was all they had. The letter to Boston was ready, waiting to be sent, but their true test would be the confrontation to come. It happened on the final day of the month. A dust cloud on the horizon was the only warning before 3 riders materialized from the heat haze. Jebediah stood on the porch, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. He'd sent Annalise and Lily inside with strict instructions to stay there no matter what. Silas Croft rode up on his fine black stallion, flanked by 2 hired thugs whose faces were as hard as the landscape. Croft was dressed in a pristine black suit, as if attending a funeral. Jebediah supposed he was. "Kane," Croft's voice was slick with triumph as he dismounted. "The day of reckoning is at hand. I've come to collect my property." "The money's not here, Croft," Jebediah said, his voice a low growl. "And you're not getting this farm." Croft laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "Oh, I'm not. And who's going to stop me?" His eyes swept the property, with an owner's gaze lingering on the cabin door. "I'll take the land, the cabin, the cattle, and the little bird you've been hiding. Send her out." "She's my wife," Jebediah said, his knuckles white on the rifle. "You've got no claim on her. Possession is the law out here, Kane." Croft sneered, nodding to his men. "And I'm about to take possession." As the thugs started to move, the cabin door opened. It was Annalise. She stepped onto the porch, holding not a weapon, but a single piece of paper. Dressed simply, she held her head with a defiant grace that seemed to silence the dusty yard. She was not the frightened woman Croft had abandoned. She was magnificent. Croft's eyes widened, a mixture of lust and fury in his expression. "There you are, my dear. Decided to come to your rightful owner." "My name," she said. Her voice clear and cold, carrying in the still air, "is Annalise Kane, and the only thing you truly own, Mr. Croft, is a defaulted loan from the Merchants' Bank of Boston." The color drained from Croft's face. His triumphant smirk faltered. Before he could form a denial, she pressed her attack, her words sharp and precise. "A debt of $50,000 you fled from. You used their capital to establish yourself here, using contracts with the exact same predatory language. I wonder what federal marshals would make of that A letter detailing your location and financial activities is already on its way to a Mr. Abernathy at the bank. He holds a particular grudge against you. They won't just take this farm, Mr. Croft. They will strip you of everything you have built on their stolen money." Croft was stunned into silence, outmaneuvered and exposed. His power in this territory was built on a foundation of lies, and she had just exposed the fault line. However, Annalise continued, her tone like ice, "I am not an unreasonable woman. There is a way to avoid this public unpleasantness." "What do you want?" Croft rasped, seeing a sliver of hope. "First," she commanded, "you will sign over the deed to this farm, marking the debt as paid in full. Second," she held up the paper she was carrying, "you will sign this sworn affidavit, witnessed by your own men, confirming you abandoned me on the road and left me for dead. It will ensure you never trouble my family again." Cornered and humiliated, the man's civility shattered. Feral rage twisted his features. "You clever little bitch!" he snarled, and his hand flew to the pistol at his waist. He was fast, but Jebediah was ready. The Winchester roared, the explosion deafening. Croft screamed as his pistol was blasted from his grasp, spinning into the dust. Before the sound had died, Jebediah had levered another round into the chamber, the rifle now aimed squarely at Croft's heart. Croft's hired men froze their hands, hovering over their own guns. They looked at their unarmed, exposed boss, then at the grim-faced farmer with the steady rifle. They were paid to be bullies, not to die for one. Slowly, deliberately, they raised their hands in the air. The fight was over. Defeated and utterly broken, Silas Croft glared at them with pure hatred. "Get the pen!" Annalise ordered, her voice trembling only slightly now that the danger had passed. With Jebediah's rifle trained on him, the disgraced land baron did as he was told. He signed the bill of sale, his hand shaking with fury. He signed the affidavit, his signature a jagged scar of ink. "Now get off my land," Jebediah commanded. Croft scrambled onto his horse, clutching his bruised hand. He gave Annalise one last look of pure, impotent venom. "This isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," Annalise replied softly. They watched him and his men retreat, a defeated trio vanishing into the haze. The immense tension finally broke, and Jebediah lowered the rifle adrenaline, leaving him weak-kneed. Suddenly the cabin door flew open, and Lily ran out straight into Annalise's arms. Annalise hugged the child fiercely, burying her face in her hair, as Jebediah walked over and put a protective hand on both of their shoulders. At that exact moment, a deep rumbling sound echoed from the Chiricahua Mountains, a sound they hadn't heard in over a year. Thunder. As they stood together, a family forged in crisis, a fat, solitary drop of rain hit the dust at their feet. Then another, and another. The long, silent siege of the drought had finally broken. The rain was coming. The rain came down in sheets, a cleansing deluge that drummed a life-giving rhythm on the cabin's roof. It washed the dust from the air and soaked into the thirsty earth, carrying the scent of a promise fulfilled. Jebediah stood on the porch, letting the cool spray mist his face when the door opened behind him. Annalise stepped out, a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside him, the awkward silence of their first weeks, replaced by the easy quiet of comrades. "I never thought I'd see it again," Jebediah said, his voice full of wonder. "Even the sky can have a change of heart," Annalise replied softly. He turned to her, the lamplight from the cabin illuminating her face. "Annalise," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "What you did today, I was just a man with a rifle ready for a fight. You saved this place. You saved me." "You saved me first," she whispered. "You found me in that barn and gave me a home. You gave me a family to fight for." The air between them grew thick with unspoken feelings. Their marriage had been a fortress built on a lie, but within its walls, something true had taken root. He reached out his calloused hand, gently touching her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with simple tenderness. She didn't pull away, instead, leaning into his warmth. "The vow we made in the barn," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the rain. "It was for protection, for convenience. It feels like a lie now, because what I feel for you, Annalise, it's not convenient. It's real." Her eyes, shining in the dim light, mirrored his own feelings. "The life I have here with you and Lily, it feels more real than my entire life in Boston ever did." "Then maybe," he said, his gaze intense, "we could make that vow again. Not for the world, just for us." A brilliant, watery smile touched her lips. "I think Jebediah Kane," she said, "that I would like that very much." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound gratitude and homecoming. It was a quiet confirmation that the pact made in darkness had been reborn as a love that tasted of rain and second chances. When they parted, the cabin door creaked open. Lily stood in the doorway, clutching her corn-husk doll. "Is the bad man gone for good?" she asked. "He is Lily-bug," Jebediah said, his voice thick. "He's gone for good." Lily looked past him to Annalise, her expression serious. She took a small step forward. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, the vulnerable question hanging in the air. "For real?" Annalise's heart swelled. She knelt and took the child's hand. "Yes, Lily," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm going to stay. This is my home now." A slow, wondrous smile spread across Lily's face. She leaned forward and whispered the single magical word that sealed their new family forever. "Mama." Jebediah pulled them both into an embrace, holding his family tight as the rain poured down, washing away the grief of the past. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but they would face them together. This wasn't just another day. It was the first. In the harshest corners of the West, hope wasn't found in gold mines or land grabs. It was found in the quiet courage of the human heart. The story of Jebediah, Annalise, and Lily isn't just about survival. It's about the extraordinary things that can happen when two broken souls have the courage to build something new from the pieces. It's a reminder that sometimes the family we choose is the one that truly saves us. Their vow made in desperation became a love story written in dust and sealed by the rain. What did you think of Annalise's incredible twist? Were you expecting her secret? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below. These stories are a passion, and your support makes them possible. If you were moved by this tale of resilience and unexpected love, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good old-fashioned story. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the Wild West. Thank you for listening.